Hi, my name is Brian Sitchie Parker. Over the past few years, I've been keeping track of my students' writing and taking note of the things that they're doing well and the things that they need to learn more about. And I'm providing this video as a little introduction to help get everybody up to speed so that you can do your best writing and do really well in this class. So this video is going to be broken down into 5 main areas. Writing style, what's the big deal? 5 features of academic writing, approaching a literature review, important aspects of APA punctuation and capitalization, and referring to sources in text and on the references page. So let's get started with the writing style. What's the big deal? Well, writing style is the way that professionals communicate with each other. So many of you learned MLA in your undergraduate programs because the Modern Language Association is the professional organization of English scholars and teachers. In social sciences, like in education, psychology, social work, nursing, and sociology, we use the writing style published by the American Psychological Association, or APA style. So there are 4 big styles that we want to talk about before we move forward. First of all, we just mentioned the Modern Language Association. That's the style that many of you learned in your undergrad program. And then we're just going to introduce here APA, American Psychological Association. But the Associated Press is another really big style guide, and that's most news organizations have some version of that. And then Chicago or Turabian is another one that many academics use in different fields. So 5 features of academic writing. So first of all, one thing we need to pay attention to is that APA style provides a foundation for effective scholarly communication because it helps authors present their ideas in a clear, concise, and organized manner. Ethical and legal principles underlie all scholarly research and writing. These long-standing principles are designed to achieve the following goals. We want to make sure that we're communicating accurately our scientific findings. We're protecting the rights and welfare of research participants and subjects. And we're making sure that people who do the research maintain their intellectual property rights. You know, I think one of the things we think about when we give assignments to our students is that we want them to go out and learn facts and bring back facts to increase their learning. But those facts were discovered by other people, and we want to make sure that those other people are continuing to get their credit where it's due. So 5 features of academic writing as listed by the Textbook and Academic Authors Association are precision, complexity, formality, objectivity, and accuracy. The first feature is precision. We want to make sure that we're using the correct words and enough detail to express precisely what we're trying to say. So for example, the student expressed anger at her classmates may be accurate, but it's not precise. Expressed anger how? How did we know she was doing that? How did we know that that was the feeling? So if we said the student, upon learning that her friend wouldn't share the doll, shouted directly into her friend's face, "I hate you," and turned and ran to the teacher's desk. This is a much more precise statement, and we have a much clearer understanding of what actually happened. With precision, you might have noticed that the sentence was longer than the original sentence was. Don't be afraid to be redundant if it makes your writing more precise. Don't hide your main points at the end of a paragraph, but be direct about what you want the reader to take away. Make your statement and then assure that they took away the right point. Tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you told them. The next feature of academic writing is complexity. We want you to use straightforward language and vary sentence lengths to improve readability. So, for example, this isn't a great sentence. It's important for us to use that technique in which we think about the functions of the behaviors before we intervene on any student behaviors. We can make that into 2 sentences that are of varied lengths that communicates the thought much more efficiently. Functional behavior assessment is critical. It is important to the success of any behavioral intervention. The next feature of academic writing that we want to talk about is formality. So we always want to consider that your audience is your professor and other scholars, and the purpose of your writing is to deal with important ideas. So therefore, saying a sentence something like, "I think it is cool that my high school teacher was able to hang with her students in a laid-back way," might be very typical of how you speak in your normal life, but you want to kind of up that game just a little bit in your academic writing, and you want to say something that's a little more formal, like, "I was impressed with the ways in which my teacher built relationships with her students." Next, we want to talk about objectivity. We want to avoid stating unexamined opinions. It doesn't mean that you can't include your own opinions, but you want to focus on stating your observations and the conclusions about how you reached those opinions. That gives everybody the chance to understand your thinking and to move the whole conversation forward. So for example, if you just said, "I was raised to believe that teachers should never discuss politics, and that's good enough for me," that's not enough depth to show, or objectivity to show that you've really thought through the issue. So saying something like this would be better. "My teachers seldom discussed politics in my classes, and that indicated to me that political topics were not safe for us to discuss in those spaces." Now, it's important to always challenge your beliefs and document how new concepts may provide reason to grow. For example, people may think that white privilege is just a trick meant to destroy our nation, and that the whole conversation shouldn't exist. However, for thinking from an objective point, you could still document your thinking and give reason to grow in this by saying that white privilege has been invisible to me because I have felt oppression from growing up in poverty. It's eye-opening to consider, however, that my skin color may have kept me from feeling even more oppressed in other ways. Additional follow-up to objectivity, one of the key features of APA style is protecting the rights and welfare of research participants and subjects. This also means protecting the privacy and dignity of individuals and groups of people that you might be writing about. So always adhere to confidentiality. Use a pseudonym wherever you're referring to an actual person, unless you are celebrating them and that person would feel celebrated by what you write. The other thing that's important is that you should always use person-first language. So you always want to highlight the humanity of people. So you would say, instead of using the word schizophrenics, you would say people with schizophrenia. Instead of saying female opiate users, you would say women who use opiates. Or you might say children with mental health disorders. There are some places that you would use identity-first language to improve the specificity of your writing. So you may say the gay men as opposed to the straight men in the study. You might say the black adolescents as opposed to the Latino ones that you're referring to. Or you could say the older women as opposed to the group of younger women that were included in your study. But you should always use the approach that the person or group you're writing about prefers. This is a particularly salient point when referring to people within the autism community. Many people prefer that they be labeled with identity first, and if that's what they ask of you, that's what you should do. So the participants with autism would be person first language, or the autistic participants would be identity first. They both can be right depending upon the wishes of the participants. In the past, we've used the word political correctness or politically correct to refer to person first language because it is the least stigmatizing way to refer to groups that have historically been marginalized. Now, when we are thinking about that today, there are many people who have started using the term political correctness in a bad way, or saying that things that are politically correct are somehow not okay or not good. But the important thing for you to remember when you're writing is that whenever you're referring to language as politically correct, it's just another way of saying that that language is respectful. So use identity first language to put the humanity of your subjects first, and use identity first language when you're needing to use very specific terms when you're reporting your results. The other thing that goes with this that's important is that you capitalize proper nouns that name racial and ethnic groups. So, Black, Native American, White, Latino, and Asian would all be capitalized. You do not capitalize colors, however. So, Black and White name these ethnic or cultural groups or racial groups, but we never use colors to refer to human groups. So Black and White are proper nouns that name racial and ethnic groups. Some authors debate on whether you should capitalize white when referring to white people. APA does say to capitalize it, though. And finally, accuracy. Academic writing has no purpose unless it's accurate. So the seriousness or importance of a piece of writing depends on its accuracy. It would be inaccurate and misleading to say a sentence or to write a sentence like, the COVID-19 virus is so small it can slip through the fabric of a mask. While that might technically be true, it is misleading. It would be better to say something like, the tiny COVID-19 virus must be carried in a droplet of water to be transmitted from person to person, and water droplets can be stopped by a properly fitting mask. It's a bit longer, but it's more accurate and would stand up to more scrutiny. So there you have the 5 features of academic writing that you should always try to attain in your own work: precision, complexity, formality, objectivity, and accuracy. All right, now we're going to talk about approaching a literature review. So a literature review is an analysis of what has been written on a given topic and is often used as a starting point in a research proposal that extends the literature in some way. Sometimes a literature review is a paper by itself, and then it would be what we'd call a research paper using high school terminology. But often, once you're in graduate school, a literature review is what you do before you begin your own study that extends the literature in a new way. A literature review summarizes and analyzes what other people have learned about and written about your topic. So, we're going to look at 4 important ways that we need to approach a literature review. First of all, we're going to talk about picking your topic, then picking your sources, organize your thoughts, and organizing your writing. Let's start with picking your topic. So, how your literature review goes ends up... Let's start with picking your topic. How your literature review ends up is going to be largely determined by how well you pick your topic. If your topic is too broad, it's going to be all over the place. It's going to be really hard to tie together all the ideas into a coherent essay that leads you to whatever is the next thing that the field needs to learn. So looking at this pyramid, if you're way at the bottom of this pyramid, there's going to be so many places you could go that it's going to be really hard for you to get to that one point where you want to pick up the story with your own research. You need to grab just a portion of the big topic until you can see a story about to emerge. For example, at the very bottom of that pyramid, you could pick a topic that was just racism. But that is way too broad of a topic. So you want to narrow it down a bit to something like racism experienced in the classroom by Black high school educators. It's narrow enough that you should be able to find some specific work that will serve as a beginning point for you in your own research, but it's not so broad that you would really be struggling to try to tell a coherent story. You could also run into some problems if you tried to pick a topic that's too narrow. So you might not be able to find any quality sources upon which you could report. So if you find that your topic is too narrow, you're going to need to back up a few paces from where you are and redo your search from a new vantage point. So for example, if you are trying to write about the experiences of white male kindergarten teachers in rural school districts in Indiana, I would almost guarantee you will not find a peer-reviewed paper on that topic. But if you take a few steps back from there and you work your way to a more broad background, you might find some papers on the experiences of male kindergarten teachers. And then you could start your story where the other stories, where those articles leave off. So the next thing, once you have your topic, you have to think about what sources you want to use. And there are generally two kinds of sources that you need to be thinking about with your literature reviews. First of all, there are primary sources. And primary sources are the sources that you want to spend most of your time with. These are sources that you will find in academic journals, and they report on the research that the authors of those papers did. They created that knowledge by doing some kind of research method. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are any sources that report the findings of the primary sources. So if you find newspaper or magazine articles, maybe you'll find some published literature reviews, maybe you see a YouTube video on something, the Center for Disease Control even, or even social media, could all be places that you'd find secondary sources. But just because someone is producing something doesn't mean that they are a credible source for your lit review. Make sure that you are defaulting to primary sources to the maximum extent possible, because that assures that you're citing the author that rightfully deserves credit for that intellectual property. Also, if you're grabbing sources from academic journals, they will also be peer reviewed, which means that experts in the field in which the studies were published have agreed that those findings make sense and should be communicated. Secondary sources generally do not have the same level of scrutiny applied to what's reported there. So always include at least a couple primary sources. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is organizing your thoughts. You should follow these steps to support good writing: pre-writing, research, drafting, revising, and publishing. I'm going to tell you that as an undergraduate student, I knew about the writing process, but I didn't always follow it. And I could get by because I could kind of end up writing papers well enough to get me a decent grade or a passing grade at least. But as the demands on my writing grew, I started to realize that I needed to definitely follow a writing process in order to get out of writing what I needed to. So you might bounce back and forth among the steps that are listed here, but they all have to be done eventually. And the last step, publishing, for a student just means that you turn in your assignment. It could mean that your assignment gets submitted to an editor somewhere for eventual publication in a magazine or journal. The first step of pre-writing. This step is about getting ideas out of your head and onto paper or some electronic format. Don't skip this step. Some people have called this brainstorming, and that's one way that you could do it. You could just do a brain dump, which is just writing everything you already know about the topic. Another way that some people have suggested is that write down all the questions you can think of that your lit review might answer. That's another way to get your mind moving to think about what you need to include in your paper so that it'll answer questions that your reader might have. I love making concept maps. I use a program called MindNode for the Macintosh. I recommend to my students who are PC users to use a program called MindMeister. This type of software is wonderful for brainstorming, concept mapping, and other types of pre-writing strategies. Just get those thoughts out of your head and get them written down somewhere. The next step is to actually do some research. Make an appointment with a librarian if you don't have any experience using the academic indexes that are available to you online. There are so many really good ones out there. Don't just do research with Google, because Google does not give you primary sources generally. And it won't generally direct you to academic journals. If you want a place to start and you don't know how to do the academic indices, you could go to scholar.google.com for access to academic literature. And if you're accessing Google Scholar from campus, it will give you free access to the journals to which the university has a subscription. So it is a good place to start if you're on campus. The best method for finding peer-reviewed studies in academic journals is to use a database that your university library has for you. Make sure to learn which ones are the best for your field. The next step is drafting. Start by making yourself an outline or by moving around the bubbles of your concept map to get yourself organized. Remember that even though you're reporting on people's results, you are writing a story that is meant to communicate something to your reader. You are telling a story, and there are distinct parts to how stories are told. Search Google for how to tell a story and take advantage of some of the advice you find there. Don't forget the importance of topic sentences. Remember all the way back to elementary school when you learned about these things. Think about how you could tell the whole story of your topic, just one sentence at a time. Then let those sentences become your topic sentences for individual paragraphs that you'll develop on each of those ideas. The next thing we're going to talk about is revising. Make sure to leave yourself some time so that you can walk away from your writing from time to time. Take a break and then come back and read what you wrote from the perspective of the reader. Take notes about where you need to include more or take out some. Have someone else read your work before you turn it in too. Very valuable practice to get into a habit of doing. If you know what a sentence is supposed to say, you're going to see it like you're thinking it. So someone who doesn't know what you're going to say will be able to read it as it really is and maybe give you better feedback. First draft, second draft, etc. is an older way of thinking about writing from a time when you had to retype your paper from top to bottom every time you made a change. Think instead about what you're writing as living on a page, and each time you read through it, you're making it evolve into something better. Just because you don't create an entire new draft doesn't mean that you don't need to revise. And then your final step is publishing. This simply means turning it over to whoever is going to critique it. If you're submitting for publishing, you'll submit it to an editor. If it's an assignment, your instructor will be the one who reads it and gives you feedback. So there you have it, the writing process: pre-writing, research, drafting, revising, and finally publishing. Organizing your writing. There are a couple things that I can tell you that will help you be a better writer. And the first is to use transition words and phrases, and the second one is to use headings. So without transition words and phrases, your writing is just a collection of unrelated sentences. The transitions are what help your reader move their thinking along with yours. So use online resources to help you. Just Google transition words, and you'll find lots of lists that can help you. Here's an example. Using things like consequently, surprisingly, notably, especially. Phrases do the same things. In the first place, in the second place, finally, another key point. In other words, as shown above. All of these different phrases also help the reader understand where you are in the story that you're trying to tell. APA is wonderful about being organized because it asks you to use headings. Headings are like roadmaps or signposts that help your reader find their way through your writing. Think about them as the different levels of indentation in an outline. Whereas some types of writing don't lend themselves to headings, academic writing really benefits from using them. APA has very specific rules on how to use headings, and there's a chart on page 48 of APA 7 manual that is very clear. Heading level 1s are used like the titles of the different sections of your paper. Here is the title that you'd find at the beginning. Another heading level 1 would be at the top of the references page. Heading level 2s are not the titles, but rather the main topics of your outline. So for example, in this case, context of the problem was part of the introduction, but it was a main topic of the introduction. And then finally, level 3 headings are like the subtopics of each main topic. They're also at the margin. They're in title case, meaning that you capitalize the beginning of each word, and they are in italics and bold. So there are two ways that really help your writing improve. using transition words and phrases and headings. Now, again, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I spent some time keeping track of things that are problem areas for my students in their writing, and punctuation and capitalization are always tricky, and there are some differences between MLA and APA. The first one is the use of the period. So page 154 of the APA manual, 7th edition, has a full discussion of this punctuation mark, but I'm going to give you a couple examples here. One important thing to note is that APA 7 says that there's only one space after a period. I am old school and I always put 2 spaces after a period, and what I've decided is that I'm going to continue putting 2 spaces after a period, but when I'm done, I'm going to go through and do a find and replace and search for a period with 2 spaces and replace it with a period with 1 space. That's my compromise. When a period and a quotation mark go next to each other, always put the period inside the quotation marks, even if it makes more sense not to. This is the way printing press operators determine that it looks best, and we call it a printing convention. So, rather than saying she would sometimes refer to her husband as her old man and putting the period after, that's wrong. You always put the period inside the quotation mark. Commas. Again, see page 155 of APA 7th edition for a full discussion of this punctuation mark. APA style requires the use of the Oxford comma. The Oxford comma is the comma before the and or in a series. So, my favorite classes in high school were math, science, and social studies. That comma is the Oxford comma, and it's required to be there in APA 7. When a comma and quotation mark go next to each other, always put the comma inside the quotation marks, even if it makes more sense not to, just like I said about the period. So they called each other brother, which was a term of endearment. Brother makes sense to be separated and then the comma go afterwards, but the comma always goes inside the quotation mark, just like the period does. Capitalization is another important aspect of APA style. See page 165 of the APA 7th edition manual for a full discussion of capitalization rules. But one thing that's really helpful to know about APA is that it is a down style. This means that you use lowercase letters unless you have a specific reason to capitalize them. So, my favorite classes in high school were math, science, and social studies, all lowercase, because none of them are proper names, proper nouns. None of these are specific titles using proper nouns, so they're all lowercase. As was mentioned earlier, however, you do capitalize the names of racial and ethnic groups, including black and white. Word processors are great. Let your word processor help you with spelling and grammar. It won't always be right, but it will help you see errors that you might not see on your own. An important thing when you're using a word processor is to let the program do the work for you. So please use a page break instead of hitting extra returns to move to a new page. Things can move around if you transfer from a Google Doc to a Word doc or to a PDF, or if you make some change later on in your writing process, it could change all your page breaks. So it's always best to use the tools that the word processor has ready for you. Same thing with the tab. Don't space over 5 spaces. Use the tab key or use a paragraph style to indent. So those paragraph styles are really useful. They might take a little effort to learn, but feel free to ask me or to Google paragraph styles and the name of the word processor that you're using, and you can get some instruction on how to do that. All right. The last part is referring to sources in text and on the references page. So in text, when you are referring to a primary or secondary source, you always refer to that source by the author's last name or the author's last names and the year of publication. So never change the order of the author's names from the way they are listed in the source. Author order is a very important detail that has been carefully decided upon. You can't change that. Remember that the purpose of citations is to give credit to the person that first published a particular idea, so use primary sources whenever possible. Also, going along with the first bullet point on this page, always refer to sources only by the author's last name and the year of publication. Don't say something like, in her book, Is Everybody Really Equal? Robin DiAngelo said that. Only use last name and year. Focus on the idea, not on the name of the book or where it was published. In-text citations can look different. So you could say, continuing that theme, Wilson, 2021, wrote. You could say, in 2021, Wilson wrote that, or Wilson stated that. Or you could say, while several scholars, for example, Smith in 2019, Wilson 2021, have shared that. On the references page, sources must be documented in a very specific manner. Different style guides have different titles for the reference page. In APA, it's called References, and you use a level 1 heading. The references page always starts on a new page and is double-spaced using a hanging indent. A hanging indent means that the first line is at the 1-inch margin and every subsequent line is indented a 1/2 inch. If you don't know how to make that happen on your word processing program, Google hanging indent and the name of your word processor. Do not try to make the hanging indent with returns, tabs, and spaces. It is a mess, so don't do it. So on the references page, there are way too many rules for me to teach you how to do them just in this video. But APA style generally calls for each entry to have 4 parts: the author, the date of publication, the title, and the source. So make sure to find a reputable guide online or use the APA 7th Manual Edition for great examples. Chapter 10 offers 114 different types of references with examples. It is so helpful, so make sure that you find a copy of that to look at. Thank you very much for your time. I wish you good writing.